Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for making the time to join us today. We have lots of ground to cover, so without further ado, we'll kick off the session today. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Some housekeeping first. The session will be recorded and the recording will be made available tomorrow, I believe, for you to watch it back and share with your network. We do have a Q&A function for you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We also have a brilliant team of people in the background who will be able to answer some of your questions on the go. And there is also a voting system. So if you spot anything that you think is particularly interesting, by all means, use the voting system. And the chat function is enabled. So next slide, please. This is the agenda for today. I will kick off the session by telling you a bit about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Inside Infrastructure program. And then you will be hearing from Magdalena Getler from the Smart Data Foundry about the Foundry system, banking data, and then on to the most exciting part, which is some of the studies and research there is currently in the pipeline using the banking data. Next slide, please. Thank you. And these are the lovely people you will be hearing from today. Next, please. Right. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we are a social change organization with the aim to support and speed up the transition to a more equitable and just future, free from poverty, where people and planet can flourish. About 3 years ago, we launched a new program, the Inside Infrastructure program, with the aim to democratize access to existing and new data sources, improve and link up existing data, and unlock new data sources, but also to enable others to make data-driven decisions and use evidence to inform policy, service provision, and so forth. How do we do this? We try to build a better picture of inequality to understand what is the challenge at hand. We do so by learning and incorporating lived experience in the work that we do ourselves or with our partners. We try to expose and fill data gaps and then explore new data sources. And in doing so, what we're trying to build is a trusted toolkit by funding interesting stuff that others are doing, or build components of the toolkit ourselves. But we're also very keen to do this in partnership, and that's why we're very focused on building connection, knowledge, and trust among our target audiences by funding events and community building, but also sharing existing tools and resources that others have been working on. Next slide, please. Now, on to the specific of this partnership with Smart Data Foundry. When we first launched the program 1 year ago, our starting point was a gap in evidence on within-year earnings, in particular around income volatility and economic security in the UK. We wanted to trial a new approach, a new data set, of which you will hear a bit more in a second from Magdalena, to understand fluctuation in income volatility and economic security at household level. But we also wanted to provide free access to close to real-time data for research and analysis purposes. And in its first iteration of this particular project, we targeted, so to speak, researchers in academia. But now we believe, and we had some evidence supporting that actually the applications of this data set and this infrastructure are actually a lot more promising and wider than we originally thought. And we referred to this particular project as income volatility, but reality is, as you will hear from the brilliant speakers today, there are so many applications that can help us by using this data to understand different patterns affecting not just the economy in general and the economic security at household level, but also to rethink how we look at things such as fuel poverty or the impact of policy decisions on the micro and microeconomic. Ultimately, the goal, of course, is to improve how we make decisions and how we support the people that we care most about and try to solve the issues that we care most about. But now, if you don't know much about the Foundry, Smart Data Foundry, and the kind of data that we are discussing here today, you will be hear all about it in a second from Magdalena Getler, who's the head of researcher at the Smart Data Foundry. Over to you, Magdalena.
Thank you, Rosario. Great. So just a little bit about Smart Data Foundry. So Smart Data Foundry is a data service, and we're based at the University of Edinburgh. And essentially what we do is we provide safe and secure access to de-identified private sector financial data for research in the public interest. So the data comes from financial institutions, such as banks, for example, and you can also hear it being referred to as digital footprint data or smart data. So it's a very rich source of information about human behavior. It's timely, so you can observe in near real time how people are reacting to certain events, for example, rise of interest rates. We were established about 3 years ago with UKRI Strength in Places Fund. And also from this February, we are also part of the UKRI and ESRC Smart Data Research UK program, which is very exciting, which is about making it easier for researchers to use data generated through everyday interactions with digital devices, for example, wearables or sat-navs, sensors, and so on. Next slide. Okay, so as you can see from the slide here, we occupy a very privileged position, I think, at the intersection of the private, academic, and public sectors, including NGOs. And in the last year, as Rosario has been just mentioned, specifically, we have actively encouraged researchers to use this new novel types of data, banking data for research, and are also starting now to work closely with policymakers to use this data to support their decision making. So I think it's fair to say that it's definitely a longer journey for this new type of data to complement, but not to substitute, of course, other data sources, like, for example, official surveys. Very briefly, we're a team of about 40 staff working across data partnerships, operations, data science, and importantly, of course, information governance and security, because we handle de-identified but still sensitive data. And I will highlight again that the data is de-identified when it comes from our data partner, and then our team of data scientists also clean, process, and prepare this data for researchers to use and analyze. Next slide, please. Great. So very briefly, I will touch on the data stewardship in our care. So we're the data stewards of the private sector data. The de-identified data essentially is stored in the Trusted Research Environment, TRE, which is a secure computing environment managed by EPCC here at Edinburgh University. And obviously, we adhere to all the established data sharing and security frameworks, such as 5 safes, with the primary control being that the data never leaves the TRE. And a couple years ago in 2021, I believe we also participated in the Information Commissioner's Office Sandbox, and as part of this initiative, we co-developed a legitimate interest assessment, and this is our legal basis to process this data for research in the public interest. And to properly use that data, we obviously conduct balancing assessments at the start of any research project. So we want to make sure that we balance the benefits to the society, to the individual, versus the potential infringement on a data subject's rights. And the next slide. Okay, so now zooming in on the actual data set. So as you know, irregular pay, and you're going to hear from our wonderful speakers in a second, irregular pay is becoming is a norm for a growing number of individuals, and hence our partnership with Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So we have created this Income Volatility Dataset, which is derived from the NatWest current account data of 1.2 million GB-wide customers. The data captures customers' income and consumption habits, so expenditure, as well as demographic information. So we have information like age, gender, and postcode district, so the first half of the postcode. This data set covers the period from early 2019 to 2023 and is fairly representative of the GB population in terms of geographic and demographic coverage, income distribution. So to this effect, we've done some work a year ago where we compared the data we receive from NatWest to a variety of published statistics, so from the Office for National Statistics, Family Resources Survey, DWP on benefits. And we will be publishing this shortly. And through our partnership with JRF, I will just say that you can view the aggregate income volatility data set in our portal. You just need to sign up for access. And inside in the portal, you can also find out a lot more about the income volatility data set. There are data dictionaries. You can download sample metadata as well. And also you can find out how you can apply to use the individual level, the granular data set, data underlying the income volatility aggregate data set for research in the trusted research environment. So there is a form that you need to fill in. And finally, the last slide, one more slide. Okay, so this data set has been used in a wide range of proof of concept research projects, and so you'll hear shortly from researchers who've used it or who are planning to use it, and also its potential for policy. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the policy making is quite complex, and we all know that academic evidence is one of the many elements in policy making. And as I said earlier, it's a journey for this data to start being used to complement, for example, other data sources like official statistics. I will conclude that public engagement is a huge focus for us, and especially in the coming next months, we will be conducting a lot of deliberate public engagement to really understand, the hopes and concerns regarding financial data for the public good. And one final slide. Okay, so basically, if you look the YouTube video, so this is coming from last webinar we ran, and this provides a lot more information about how we run the trusted research environment. So on that note, I will pass on to Professor Jonathan Crook, who share his experience of using banking data for research. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. What I'm going to talk about is a project that we've applied money for to look at the effects of micro and macroeconomic policies on individuals in society. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our team is of four. Galina Andreeva is the PI, myself and Andrea Stonehauer are economists, and Tina Harrison has spent many years looking at financial well-being and financial literacy, and we also have a research assistant. Next slide, please. So if you've looked at the news, you'll have seen lots of changes in the macroeconomy, interest hikes, which on the right from screenshots suggest there's major implications for low-income families, changes in the rate of payment of universal credit, inflation, particularly in fuel, inflation in the case of food prices. And what we're going to do is use the data to look at the implications of this for a number of different things. Next slide, please. So the research questions in our project are these. First of all, we're going to look at what we mean by financial vulnerability. The FCA have a definition, but economists typically use a different one called hand-to-mouth, which, broadly speaking, is whether or not your liquid assets are less than 2 months of salary or income generally. We're going to use different definitions, compare the geographic spread, compare the socio-demographics associated with each of these definitions to see to what extent they align. Then we're going to look at the question of how these distributions of vulnerability measured in this way vary across the UK. Are there pockets which our definition, or the hand-to-mouth definition, reveal that other data sources don't? We'll then get into the meaty bit, which is how do the following impact on incomes and expenditures? And we're particularly interested in financially vulnerable people, looking at things like the lower 2 deciles of income distribution, those who are hand-to-mouth, and so on. So we're interested in changes that affect everyone, like interest rates, inflation rates, and so on, and more small micro changes such as eligibility for different payments for benefits, changes in the rate of pay for different benefits like universal credit, which we're going to concentrate on as one part of the project. And then when there are these changes, if there are changes in prices, how do people cope with this? What do they do? Do they reallocate their expenditure between different goods and services, or do they borrow? And then finally, what policies are suggested by our results? Next slide, please. So the analysis is in two parts. We start by an aggregate descriptive analysis. And here the idea is to, first of all, as I said, compare the two definitions for identifying vulnerable groups, and then look at the socio-demographic characteristics that are available in the data in lots of different geographic regions to find segments in particular locations where vulnerability is highest and where it's lowest. Then we're going to look again at aggregate, so it's time series work aggregated across all the individuals in the data set. Look at each type of expenditure and each type of income we have data for in relation to various common changes, as I mentioned, interest rates, inflation, food inflation, for example, fuel inflation, and so on. And then we're going to look at spillover effects using the aggregate data. In other words, for example, look at the changes in energy prices on different types of expenditures by individuals who have different degrees of vulnerability. So we can look at the lowest income decile, for example. We can look at those who are hand to mouth, and so on. Next slide, please. Then we're going to look at using individual level data. Now, the data in the data set is for individuals. There's no way you can identify households as such. And then look at the effects of changes in the prices of some goods on expenditures on others. So, for example, what happens if the prices of food go up to expenditure on fuel? What happens if the price of fuel goes up to expenditure on food and things like that? Again, we're going to do it for each different decile of income and degree of vulnerability. Then we're going to look at, in particular, about how individuals reallocate their budgets when certain inflation things happen. So suppose interest rates go up, those with mortgages, how do they pay for that? Do they spend less on food? Do they spend less on fuel? When the price of fuel goes up, what do people do? Do they spend less on groceries, for example? These are things of absolutely crucial policy importance, because if you're going to change things which you can, over which policymakers have control, then you need to know what the implications are, and in particular, what the distributional implications are throughout different segments of society. And then finally, and this will take quite a lot of the project, we'll look at the causal effects. So we'll adopt particular techniques which allow us to posit counterfactual situations econometrically, to look at how these particular shocks affect vulnerable groups. So if there is a shock, and there was in the time period we've got, to the rate of pay of universal credit, how will that affect expenditure on groceries, for example? How will it affect expenditure on fuel and heating? Next slide, please. So to give you a brief taster of some exploratory analysis we've done, we've looked at volatility of different sources of income. We've looked at benefits, we've looked at salaries, we've looked at total income as we've got here. And just to give you some idea as to what these time plots look like, here we've got a measure of volatility, which is actually the coefficient of variation. So it's a standard deviation across individuals at each 5-week period divided by the mean. And there are a few things you can get out from this. This is by age. First of all, the youngest, which is a top line, those are 18 to 29, they have the highest degree of volatility, followed by those 60 to 69, which is the line immediately below, most easily seen on the left. Another thing to notice is that volatility is lowest for those who are 70 to 79 and those are 80 plus, which is the lowest line, kind of pinky line. The third thing to notice is that volatility over this period, so that's August 2019 through February 2024, has been converging. So the volatility is more similar now than it was 5 years ago. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at volatility by gender, and what the only thing really, well, lots of things you could pull out of it. I don't have time to analyze the causes of these. I'm just describing what we see. Volatility of income for men is higher than that for women. Now, it could be that men have the volatility could be because a higher proportion of men are in employment, and that maybe give more volatile income than women. We don't know. We've got to work on that. Another thing which comes out, which actually is not so apparent from this slide, is when you look at periods of high COVID, actually volatility increases. I'll leave that hanging. Next slide, please. Another thing we can have a look at is by income decile, which of course is crucial for this particular project. And what you see is that the lowest decile, which is the top line, have higher volatility than most others. But the highest decile, in other words, those with the highest income, top 10%, is the line below, the light blue one. So those with the highest, in the highest decile, those with the lowest decile both have higher volatility than all the other deciles by income group. Okay, next slide, please. This gives you an overall picture of some of the relationships that you can pick out with the data. So basically what we've got here is for each decile, and each row is a decile, you're looking at the share of income which comes from each source. So the horizontal sums to 1, okay? Multiply those numbers by 100 and you get the percentages. The darker colors show the highest numbers. And just to summarize it, because you can't see it immediately, at higher deciles, in other words, those with higher income, as we go down towards the bottom of the table, the percentage of income from benefits goes down, the percentage from interest goes up, the percentage from pensions goes down, but the percentage from salary rises at first, peaks, and then goes down again. Now, these are not really surprising, but it gives comfort as to the validity of the data. Okay, next slide, please. Just to show you that we've looked at these for other sources of income, and this one's we think is very interesting. This is total benefits from all sources. And what you see is those in the higher age group have the highest volatility. And what's more, there are these peaks, which we think are probably due to winter fuel payments, but we're not 100% sure. We're still diving into it. Next slide, please. So that gives you a taster of a very small amount of the examination we've done of the data. Brief word on the advantages and challenges of using this data, and I think that's going to be spoken about in more detail in a moment. But from our experience, and we've been using this for close to a year now, there are many advantages of using this data rather than survey data. So lots of standard surveys I've got up here. The thing about surveys is they tell respondents say what they've done. It's not a measure of what they actually did. It's a measure of what they say they did. And then you get all sorts of problems like recall bias and so on. The advantages, as Rosario said, is this data is bang up to date. It's weekly, it's high frequency, and the sample is massive at close to 1.2 million. Compare that with some of the surveys you've got here. The sample sizes are very, very much smaller. But they do rely on population sampling weights, these other surveys. But thanks to this helpful paper that Magdalena mentioned, it is possible to gain weights to gross up, or rather represent a population of adults in GB from the data in that SDF actually have. The challenges, well, I've mentioned representativeness. There are one or two variables which are not that representative, but on the whole, the representative nature is remarkably good compared with, say, the Family Resources Survey and other DWP data. some products are and services are actually aggregated in terms of the values, but more disaggregated data is becoming available. There are limited socio-demographics. The data is kept in the TRE. There are very, very, very good reasons for that, obvious reasons. You need permission in order to export any results. However, our experience is permission comes quickly, and we've had absolutely no problems with that at all. So we strongly recommend the data. It's great stuff. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Some really interesting stuff there. Lots of questions popping up in my head already. Right, let's look at another example of how this data could be applied to shape policy. And we're going to hear very shortly from Simon Pittaway, who's Senior Economist at the Resolution Foundation. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Rosario. Hi, everyone. So we can flip to the next slide. I'll just give a brief introduction on what the Resolution Foundation is and how we've thought about this data. So for those who haven't heard of us, the Resolution Foundation is a think tank based in Westminster, and our mission is to improve the living standards of British households on low to middle incomes. And we do that in a few ways. So one of the ways we do that is by proposing specific policy changes, feeding into live debates that are going on at the time. But we also try and do that by shaping the debate around low to middle income households in Britain, to frame that debate in a way that we think is helpful for improving their living standards in the long run. And as part of that, we're currently undertaking a big project that's looking at the changing economic circumstances of these households in the bottom half of the income distribution that's called Unsung Britain. And this is a really big project, so it's covering all manner of things from their experience with the labour market to caring. But as part of that, I'm writing a paper with one of my colleagues on how living costs and spending patterns have changed over time. And this is the sort of thing that the Income Volatility Database is really helpful. So I'm just going to say a bit about we're in the process of scoping this research and give some thoughts on how we think the data might fit into what we're trying to do. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So a bit of background to this is we've done some previous research looking at how spending patterns have changed over time, and up to the pandemic, we feel pretty certain that the share of income or share of spending going on essential categories like food, clothing, housing was rising over time. So it rose between the financial crisis and the pandemic as people's budgets got more stretched. And that stretch was particularly acute, as you might expect, at the bottom of the income distribution. And, we have a pretty strong sense that's got worse over the past few years with the cost of living crisis. But trying to map out exactly how much worse it's got has been really difficult. And that's because of some issues with the ONS data that I'll talk through next. So next slide, please. Oh, and the next one, sorry. Brilliant. So the first issue with the ONS data is that it's never been particularly timely. So just to say, this isn't trying to rag on the ONS. What they do is really important. And it just takes time to administer surveys, clean the data, and make that available. So this is an example. So the latest iteration of the Living Cost of Food Survey. The headlines were published in August 2024, and that was for data going back to April 2022 to March 2023. And we actually got the microdata till earlier this year, so it's almost a kind of 2 or 3 year lag between the survey being out in the field and us actually getting our hands on the data. So that's particularly tricky at the moment when things are moving really quickly in the real world. Next slide, please. And then the second issue with the ONS data, which is a kind of new thing, is that it's become much less reliable in recent years. So if you are users of any of the ONS surveys, you might be aware of this problem that response rates to a lot of their surveys really fell off a cliff during the pandemic. And that's meant that the data that they're based on is increasingly subject to sampling error and biases in terms of response rates. And so, the ONS is working hard to try and solve this, but in the meantime, we have less faith in their surveys than normal, and so we're increasingly in the market for other sources of data. And this is where the income volatility data comes in. So if we can flick 2 slides forward, please. So why is the income volatility data particularly good? So as Jonathan said, it's really timely and it's really granular in terms of its time. So you can pick up changes that occur on very short time periods. So, for our interests, we will want to look at what happened when people's energy bills went up. And for a lot of people, those bills kind of changing in very discrete ways. And next slide, please. The second advantage of the data is on the expenditure side of things, it's really detailed. So I'm not expecting you to read all the different variables here, but this is a snapshot of all the different expenditure categories that are in the data. And that's like a really, really long list. So that's really good for us in terms of building up a really granular picture of people's spending patterns. And then finally, if we move on to the next slide, as Jonathan mentioned, the representativeness of the data it's not perfect, but no data is. Well, almost no data is. But it compares really well to the Family Resources Survey, for example. And we feel pretty confident that, it's giving us a pretty good picture of what's going on, particularly amongst the group of people that we care about, which is those on low to middle income. So, this is a kind of early stage project. It's feeding into this broader piece. It's going to run for a while. I think in January we'll have a launch event where this piece of research combined with some other stuff that we're doing is all going to come together, and we're going to launch a big kind of policy agenda for low to middle income households in the coming years over the rest of the decade. And so that's the end point. And so I hope to be able to come back to you at some point with some updates on actually using the data. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Simon. That was brilliant. And we'll keep an eye on the Resolution Foundation, of course. We're eager to see what you guys will come up with. Last but not least, we are going to be hearing from Torran Semple, who's a PhD student in engineering and data science at the University of Nottingham, who is planning to use the data to challenge how we classify fuel poverty. Torran, take it away.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Today, I'll mostly be discussing how we intend to use the income volatility data to enhance fuel poverty classifications. But like Simon, we haven't actually had the chance to fully explore the data yet, so I'll be discussing some of our previous research to contextualize the proposed study. Next slide, please. So I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Nottingham, and we're particularly interested in researching English fuel poverty definitions because they've recently evolved quite a bit during the 2010s, and I'll describe this in some more detail on the following slide. I also just mention here that we have some partners in local government currently, including Nottingham City Council and Broxton Borough Council, who've helped to disseminate our findings, but we're always interested in attracting partners that can elevate our research to the national policymaking level. Next slide, please. So this just provides some necessary background information. The timeline here shows the evolution of fuel poverty definitions in England from the first academic definition in 1983 until the introduction of the most recent low-income, low-energy efficiency definition in 2019, which I'll call Lily from now on. Apologies for all the acronyms coming up. But all the definitions here, except the 1983 one, have at some point been the government's official approach to measuring fuel poverty in England. So I won't read all these out in full, but the first notable change here is the change from the 10% definition to the Low Income High Cost Indicator, or LIHC, in 2016. The initial 10% definition was very simple and considered a home to be fuel poor if more than 10% of income was spent on energy. So this is what we call an absolute fuel poverty definition, but LIHC says a home is fuel poor if it spends more than the median home on energy and has residual income below the poverty line. So those of you who are familiar with poverty metrics or indicators will know that this change from the absolute 10% definition to the relative LIHC definition will mean that the rate of fuel poverty ends up being tethered to the median home. And the reason that this is problematic is that significant rises in consumer energy costs, like we've had recently, end up hardly affecting the rate of fuel poverty. So this is why we're interested in researching these in particular. So yeah, that's LIHC. The Lilly definition is very similar in the sense that it's also a relative fuel poverty definition. And the only difference is that the energy cost criterion of LIHC was replaced by a similar energy efficiency based criterion. So hopefully that's not total information overload, but the key point to note here is that relative definitions don't always accurately reflect the increased financial pressure of increasing energy costs in low and middle income homes. Next slide, please. So to clear up what the Lilly definition actually looks like in practice, this graph shows some hypothetical homes with household income on the x-axis and FPEER, which is essentially household energy efficiency on the y-axis. And the slanting red line is the poverty line adjusted for energy costs. So these intersecting lines classify homes depending on income and efficiency. And the bottom left dark pink points are the homes that are classed as fuel poor. So the worry here is that low income, high energy efficiency homes up in the top left quadrant are wrongfully excluded because these are homes with very low income that in many cases will struggle to afford sufficient energy. Next slide, please. So this is taken from our previous study of the Lilly definition, where our previous study helped to prove that some low-income homes were being wrongly overlooked by the Lilly metric. So the study had two parts. The first was a spatial analysis, and the findings of this are presented in the bivariate map here. So the key thing to note about this map, which shows Lilly fuel poverty against index of multiple deprivation in London, is that there are surprisingly large disparities between fuel poverty and deprivation scores in a lot of areas. And this is shown by light bluish and turquoise areas. So these are basically areas with high deprivation but low Lilly fuel poverty. And we reckon that this happens due to the Lilly definition's omission of some low-income, high-efficiency homes. The second part of this study was a subjective fuel poverty survey, which had around 3,000 responses from a representative sample of London residents. And subjective fuel poverty gauges various aspects of fuel poverty, like heating or eating trade-offs and self-reported indoor temperature assessments. So it can be useful for gauging actual on-the-ground conditions if we don't trust the Lilly estimates. So ultimately here we found that subjective fuel poverty was around 2.5 times higher than Lilly fuel poverty in London, which given that this was in 2021 when energy costs were very high, this shows that the Lilly definition significantly underestimates fuel poverty, particularly during periods of economic hardship. The link there is just if you want to see the full paper. Yeah, we can also say at this point, we claim that the Lilly definition isn't compatible with a fair energy transition, since the effects of changing energy costs aren't properly accounted for. Next slide, please. So now that we know that Lilly underestimates fuel poverty in some financially vulnerable homes, we're interested in exploring the benefits of other definitions, which is the motivation for the current study using the income volatility data. Because to validate alternative approaches, we need access to high granularity income data. So at this point, we think the best approach to measuring fuel poverty are those that can also account for household living standards, as well as the proportion of income spent on energy, which generally aligns with the European Parliament's most recent guidance on the issue. So one existing definition that already achieves this is the Scottish Government definition, which considers a home to be fuel poor if it spends more than 10% of income on energy, and after energy expenses, the remaining household income doesn't fall below the minimum income standard, which is an indicator of the income needed to maintain a socially acceptable standard of living. Next slide, please. So finally getting to the proposed study, we want to use the income volatility data to develop and validate new and existing fuel poverty definitions, including the Scottish definition, but also other formulations. As others have discussed today, we think that the income volatility data could be even more useful after integrating it with other data sets. In our case, we'll probably look to see if we can merge the data with the EPC database, which we can use to estimate energy consumption and costs per area. In terms of likely outcomes, the proposed study can provide competing fuel poverty statistics according to a range of definitions, and this will allow us to demonstrate that the definitions that have most modern relevance, essentially. And yeah, I should also say that after re-estimating fuel poverty with the competing definitions, we'll conduct an exploratory sensitivity analysis to see how competing rates of fuel poverty change given changing external factors like rising energy costs or significant changes to the housing stock, like big retrofit projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so this again just is a summary of the proposed study outcomes and how I think they might affect policy at the local and national level. So we've already got some strong partnerships with local authorities. So we've managed to achieve some local policy impact in the sense that we've convinced Nottingham City Council and Broxton Borough Council to factor in the inaccuracies of the Lilly definition in their local fuel poverty strategies. And Broxton Council have already actually started gauging subjective fuel poverty to complement Lilly statistics, so that's quite encouraging. In terms of national policy impact, we're hoping that the proposed study can continue to demonstrate the weaknesses of the Lilly definition, and also provide recommendations for a definition that is more suited to modern and future requirements, which will hopefully lead to Lilly being succeeded at some point. Affecting national policy might be a bit ambitious, but we have people from Joseph Rowntree Foundation and other influential parties on board, and I think we can start to generate some political pressure. Next slide, please. Okay, so this final slide just summarizes the main points from the previous study of the Lilly definition and the expected outcomes of the proposed studies. So hopefully I've convinced you that the Lilly definition isn't accurate enough, and as a result isn't compatible with measuring the fairness of energy transitions, since many low-income homes are omitted by default from fuel poverty statistics. The inaccuracy of the Lilly definition is the motivation for the proposed study, using the financial data, where we'll hopefully again show that Lilly undercounts fuel poverty in many low-income homes. We can also provide a clear picture of the alternative fuel poverty definitions that are more compatible with adjacent modern political agendas like energy transitions. Next slide. That's me done. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Torran. And of course, huge thanks to all the speakers. I think you'll manage to provide really good examples of the potential of this data. We're not suggesting that all of a sudden we should drop using existing data sets, but clearly there are ways in which we can apply this data to challenge current definitions and understanding of social economic inequality in the country, but also to potentially solve some of the issues around the timeliness of existing data sets, the accuracy and how representative and inclusive they are of all the different people and households across the country, but also to help us rethink how we inform our interventions, grant-making activities, and more broadly, how the world of policy and advocacy should be thinking a bit more about what other resources we can bring to the table to build a better understanding of inequality and poverty in the country. Now, this is the end of the session. I'm aware there's a lot of content that you needed to digest, but this is also for all of you watching from home, your time to shine, so to speak. So I will invite all the speakers to come off camera, and for you at home, just to ask any questions you might have on what you've seen today. In the meantime, while people think about some of the questions that they might want to ask, something I did not mention before, I know that Magdalena touched base on it briefly. So currently my Foundry is made of two components, so to speak. One is the publicly available dashboard where the data is aggregated and presented, and then of course the safe haven where you can actually access the raw data set to perform analysis. As part of this partnership, what we have done at Joseph Rowntree Foundation is to make available some licenses, and this is what the speakers today are effectively using. So licenses available for free to apply for access to the data. And as I said before, we look at this through the lenses of income volatility, but really, as you might have learned from the speakers today, the applications are potentially endless, and this data could be used to look at all sorts of different patterns relating to social and economic characteristics and behavior of the household across the UK. Right. Looks like people are a bit shy at home.
And I'll add
Yes.
that the data set, so if anyone is interested, you can contact us, contact me directly, or there was a link to the portal or to the inside infrastructure provided by JRF. I would say that as just to make sure that the granular microdata is available for researchers across the UK, and also you don't need to come from higher education institutions. You can be a researcher in a think tank or like Simon and Rosario Foundation. So you just need to apply and provide us justification why you want to use this data. And obviously this then it undergoes a variety of ethical and governance checks. So there is a bit of obviously it's sensitive data, so it takes, as Jonathan was alluding, it's one of the constraints. It takes time to access this data, but it's not, it's about 10, 12 weeks. So it's not too, too long, basically. So Torran, you should be getting access to this data soon as well.
Thanks, Magdalena. We actually have a really interesting question in the chat. So what are the biggest challenges in using financial data for policy? Any volunteer? I don't want to put people on the spot.
I can kick off and then maybe, So I would say that using financial data, so running the data service for a couple of years, I mean, definitely the data skills you need to have, R, Python, that there is a certain level of data literacy you need to possess. I mean, there are also limitations in terms of data quality, and as everybody has been alluding to gently. So first thing, that data coming from financial institutions, I think we need to be open, has never been, intended for research. So that's why we at Smart Data Foundry, we spend considerable amount of time to cleaning, to processing, to making this data research ready, as we say. As I mentioned earlier, it's stored in trusted research environment, which means you have to be accredited researchers to get access to it. So there is a little bit of time that you need to apply and wait. I think there is some I think we haven't mentioned about issues around, for example, missing data. So many of you will have more than one banking account, so you need to essentially make sure that this is the limitations you're aware of when you do your analysis, and whether you can still carry on knowing those limitations. So yes, you can have many banking accounts. So we don't see, obviously we only see, let's say, NatWest in this data set. Joint accounts as well, there are limitations. We cannot see who is in the joint account. So there are some limitations you need to be aware of. But there are always limitations of any type of data, we're just saying. So we just need to be aware of this and consider this when you're using it for your research analysis. But it's an amazing near real time, as we were just saying. It's a near real time. You can see what's happening in the economy, in the society, how people are reacting to current events. And I think this is the power of this data, and and how it can complement other data sources that we're going to be using in your research.
Thanks, Magdalena. Simon, really keen to hear from you on the subject.
Yeah, so we've, as I said, we've not yet got our hands on this data, but we have used other bank account data in the past in policy work. And I think the main pushback that you get is on kind of the representativeness of the data. And I think people are comfortable with the idea that household surveys are fine, which you know, to varying degrees, they may or may not be, but they have, you know, they've been around for years. The ONS do a lot of work, as Jonathan was saying, in terms of weighting the data to be representative of the country. And so when you use a different source of data that people are less familiar with, at least in policy circles, that's often the first thing that comes into their head. It's like, okay, is this actually representative? And I think with this data specifically, you know, what I've seen is pretty encouraging, and it's great that people have, you know, already done some work to work out weights to make that even better. So yeah, the sample size is really helpful. You know, the fact that NatWest is a really big, like a big bank and a big provider. I've seen other papers using kind of, you know, fintech type apps, which is, you know, selecting on a very specific group of people who use their products, whereas NatWest is kind of, you know, more broad-based customer base. So yeah, I think the representativeness is definitely the thing that has come up most in the past. But yeah, lots of encouraging data on that side with the Income Volatility database.
Thanks, Simon. We have another interesting question. This is probably for you, Magdalena, in the chat from Audrey.
What question is it? I don't think.
So Audrey is asking, is it possible there are limitations on the data because it's coming just from the NatWest group, right? Mm-hmm. And as a brand, it might not reflect actually the population at large in the UK. And I know this is a question that come up also in previous webinars. So
yes, so I think as I think Simon was already alluding to this. So this is current account data. So overall, we get 5.3 million. This income volatility is 1.2, so it's a huge sample. So this is around 10% of GB population, and we have done quite a lot of work, and I'm hoping we'll be publishing this quite soon. So our data scientists did work on looking at the geographical, you know, distribution. We've done some mapping on the postcode district we get to data zone, so LSOAs in England and so forth. And so we have roughly about 2 and 4% of coverage for most areas of GB. And we also look at demographic distribution and had good coverage by gender and by age. Compared to the GB population estimates. Again, we're comparing this to the national, you know, published statistics. We also look at the income distribution. So this is we compared to ONS data from income tax records, payee, and also we did work on compared to benefits from DWP. So we've done some work on you know, you're still getting 10% of GB population, which is pretty amazing, I think. So yeah, so it's relatively unbiased. There is always some biases, but it's relatively unbiased. But
thanks,
please, more than happy to have you know, conversations and kind of dig deeper to what your needs are, and you know, and your specific research case, and then we can have a conversation.
Can I add to that?
Go for it.
The crucial thing is, what do you want to do with the data? How do you want to use it? And what inferences do you want to make, and about whom? If you want purely descriptive statistics, means, medians, that sort of stuff, then you clearly need to wait if you want to gross up to the intended population. If you want to look at multivariate relationships, regressions, that sort of stuff, then you don't need the weights under many circumstances. And this data is randomly sampled. So that is very encouraging for not needing weights in this context. If you go back to the descriptive statistics, I've seen the work that Magdalena's talked about, the comparisons with Family Resources Survey, DWP data, ONS data, and so on. And I completely agree with her that apart from one or two minor examples, it is remarkably, the distributions are remarkably similar. But if you take these distributions from the FRS and the ONS as population distributions, then by looking at the distributions in the bank data, you can actually come up with frequency weights to re-weight the data that the bank's given, and so come up with appropriate descriptive statistics. So whilst it's right, there are limitations. I wouldn't be too upset about them. I think they're overcomable if you are careful in the way you do the modelling.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I think it was Simon who said before, there's no such thing as a perfect data set. And I think it's also useful to remind everyone joining us today that this is 1 year into the project, what is essentially a very new project. So we are very keen to hear this kind of questions and feedback from people engaging with either the dashboard or the data set, because we will take those on board and try our best to improve. So this is not perfect. This is not the final version. And this data should also be looked potentially in triangulation with other data sets and existing information, not in silo. But it's a step forward towards a new source of information and evidence that could help us rethink how we define poverty and all the measures associated to poverty, but also how we the third sector in particular, which of course that's where I'm coming from, working for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, how can we access or make available data that otherwise is not used in the third sector at all, but is actually used a lot maybe in the private sector and so forth. Jonathan, there's a question for you in the chat. When can we expect the results of your study?
Mm-hmm.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. If we get our project funded, then the scheduled start date is September, and it's for 2 years. But we would hope that we would be able to produce some kind of descriptive results of the volatility things that I was talking about over the next 3 or 4 months, subject to getting permission. But as I said, we haven't had anything so far. Just to show what initial descriptive stuff can show about volatility over time and explanations for different groups, because we've sliced it several ways, as you can see. So the big project, probably results will come out in about 18 months from now starting, and then carrying on from there.
Thank you. So we're almost at time. So one final question. What can we do as a society to advance the discussion? I'll kick off. I think we just need to, first of all, we're trying to solve part of the issues, if you like, by building the inside infrastructure, kind of, data and evidence and digital-led set of resources for the sector and beyond to be able to actually get their hands on stuff that otherwise will not be available, will be very costly and requires time and analytical skills. This is just one of the things that we're doing as part of that intention. But really, I think at the end of the day is, from my perspective, at least, this is information that can help us to challenge how we think and define poverty. Because at the end of the day, it's not really just about poverty, it's the inequality that we, unfortunately, many of us still experience in this country. And it's never just financial, it's social, emotional, physical, and so forth. So we need to open up our horizons a bit, whether it's data or lived experience, and try to learn from what's happening around us. Anybody else would like to say anything on this?
I can just briefly say that for me, it's also about how do we inject that research expertise, so the research that Jonathan is doing and his team, to policy making. How can we bridge those two words a little bit more? I think there is importance of making research accessible. So Jonathan mentioned that you'll be making some sort of early results accessible, or in a blog post, or something that can be more digestible to the public, and sharing sort of early findings. I think that's really powerful as well. I think we are doing some work with local authorities, and I think there is a potential to do more, and definitely combining this data with administrative data, there's a huge field of actually having a more, I guess, holistic view on poverty, on inequalities in general. I think definitely JRF plays a key role, or other NGOs as well, and sort of, as you mentioned, bringing different stakeholders together, doing roundtables. So we start to kind of joining the dots a bit more. So yeah, and also I'll finish on funders. So funders have a role as well in encouraging, for example, government to be using this data more as well. So I'll finish on that. Anyone else wants to add? We're on time also.
Okay, well, that's the end of the session. Massive thank you to all of you, Torran, Magdalena, Jonathan, and Simon. And of course, massive thank you to all of you watching from home or watching the recording when this will be available. Don't be a stranger. Get in touch if you have any questions, and let us know how we can make this resource better, more useful and usable for all of you. On that note, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good one. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosario.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.